Said this last week, but I'll say it again. I'm so glad to be here with you again. I feel like I'm still kind of getting back in the swing of things since being out on medical leave since early February, and I was thinking about it, and it feels a little bit like I gave up going to church for Lent, which is kind of a new experience for me, as you might imagine. And it just seems as though a lot has happened, and the part of the work is just kind of catch up, and realizing, oh shoot, I missed that. One such event was that Father Greg Boyle came to Portland to speak at the Alberta Rose Theater as part of the Oregon Humanities Consider This series. Anybody in here go to that? Doug? No, okay. The theme for this year's series is fear and belonging, and I would have loved to hear Father Doyle address that dichotomy. Now, maybe you're familiar with Boyle, and maybe not. He is a Jesuit priest who served as a pastor in Boyle Heights, a neighborhood in Los Angeles, during the wave of gang-related violence that began in the 1980s and peaked in 1992, claiming the lives of more than 1,000 people in that year. And while most civic leaders at the time were united in believing that mass incarceration was the answer to this spiraling crisis, Boyle and members of his parish and community offered a different approach, namely treating gang members as human beings. Eventually, Boyle founded and still directs Homeboy Industries, a secular nonprofit which employs and trains former gang members in a range of ventures from screen printing to baking to grocery delivery, while also providing critical support from material aid to tattoo removal. Now, when I first heard of Boyle about 10 years ago, around the publication of his first book, Tattoos on the Heart, which maybe some of you read, I felt a little bit skeptical. I was worried that he was yet another white savior type figure being elevated by the establishment, like a male Roman Catholic Michelle Pfeiffer from the well-known but misled 1995 film Dangerous Minds, featuring Gangsta's Paradise by Coolio, of course. More of you need to, no, don't see that film. I need to feel, is anybody out there grew up in the 90s? See me afterward. But the more I've learned about Boyle and his work, the more I've come to see him as a model of allyship and an important spiritual guide for our time, a clarion voice summoning us to intentional community, interfaith cooperation, mystic spirituality, and social change. You see, when Boyle began his ministry in the eponymous seeming neighborhood in LA and shocked people by riding his bike freely through the streets of what had been named the most dangerous neighborhood of the most dangerous city in America, he felt compelled to help. At that time, he believed that employment could be the primary driver of peace. Nothing stops a bullet like a job, he used to say. But in the decades since then, his perspective has evolved, as things tend to do. Though employment is still important and an essential aim of the enterprises he manages, Boyle now believes there's something much more profound at stake. In a profile about him written for the University of Southern California's Center of Religion and Civic Culture, Boyle shared that he now believes his mission is deeper and more compelling than job training. At this point, he says, his goal is to reconnect people to a sense of their unshakable goodness. Now, that actually is his whole definition of restorative justice, healing the scars that prevent people from realizing their goodness, wholeness, and nobility in God's eyes. You see, Doyle rejects the idea that we are merely a product of our choices, but rather that we arise out of our context. And if that context lacks love and grace, and is instead filled with violence and fear, we may never know that we are cherished. So Father Boyle's way does not seek to provide moral instruction, but rather to offer the experience of being loved, and to apply a method of extravagant tenderness that reinforces his neighbor's fundamental dignity and acceptance. Now, of course, this habit of love often involves giving people second chances and third chances, infinite chances, until the sense of one's unshakable goodness can be fully embraced. Now, in 2022, Boyle published a new volume of reflections entitled, Forgive Everyone Everything. And I gotta tell you, when I read that title, Forgive Everyone Everything, I saw it on Amazon, and I thought, I mean, like, not everyone, right? Not all the things. We're not going to forgive all the things. We're going to forgive some large proportion, but not all the things. Not all the people, right? That's just wild, right? That's bananas. There's some pretty bad things that happen out there. There's some pretty bad folks out there. Doesn't he know that? And his answer is, yes, he knows that, and yes, he means forgive everyone everything. In the introduction, he writes, there's no denying how difficult things can be. But the way out to a place of resilience, to a place of restoration, relies on one thing: forgive everyone everything. Which is kind of mind-blowing, right? And you might think that this guy is just operating out of some sort of totally unrealistic place of idealism, but if you read more about his writings, you find out that's not the case. This perspective is born out of his profound experiences of God's presence and love, is his own life emanating out to share with others. And here is where I come to the resurrection. I know that's an important topic today. Right? The resurrection, this really enigmatic event, something that cannot be explained but presents a challenge for some preachers and certainly some believers. I feel as though what usually happens on Easter is that I'm preparing to speak about this sacred mystery, and I feel as though I'm just looking into the empty tomb and I'm rendered speechless. You know, it's 4 a.m. Sunday morning and I have 2/3 of an Easter message, and I'm thinking, what does one say about something that's totally beyond words? Which is why I'm so grateful for the journey that this church was on during Lent. I didn't really give up church for Lent. I was watching you on YouTube. So I'm so grateful for the journey that this church has been on, exploring the life of the disciple Simon Peter. Because it's really helped me kind of turn my attention to him as I'm looking at the whole resurrection story. And I think I've learned something important, which I'm going to share with you. Now, whether you've been with the church these last few weeks, it doesn't matter. What's important to know is that Peter was perhaps Jesus' most well-known disciple. But that's not necessarily because he was like the best one, the most faithful, consistent, or steadfast. Rather, the stories about Peter in the gospel present a very eager but often imperfect pupil. One whose enthusiasm was often misguided, whose love was often inconsistent, and whose trust was often incomplete. If you read the Gospels, you just see that Peter's kind of wandering. He's just like not the most consistent. He kind of flits back and forth from rock-solid faithfulness to profound self-doubt, from humble devotion to self-inflated demands. In fact, when I read this story all the way through, as I've been going along with you, there are times when it seems like Peter's acting in kind of a gospel-related melodrama. Have you noticed this? Like, Peter says, Jesus, command me to come to you and walk on the water. And 2 seconds later he says, OMG, I'm drowning. I mean, he's really like, he's not a subtle character. Jesus says, friends, I'm going to be executed if I continue with my work. And Peter says, no, Jesus, I won't let you. I mean, it's over the top. Jesus says, I'm going to wash your feet. Peter says, you'll never do that. and this is how yes. Is this how you read the gospel too? Jesus says, your feet, Peter, they're dirty. He says, then wash all of me. You know, he's very let's be very careful. I was told no sudden movements, so let's not get too involved. And I wonder sometimes when I read if it's this drama, this like banter between these intimate friends that makes the contrast of what happens next so much more stark, right? At the end of Jesus' life, when he has been handed over to suffer, When the moment is dire and solidarity desperately needed, Peter's enthusiasm is nowhere to be found. He denies knowing Jesus and shrinks back into the shadows of fear with only his own shame as company. But then, this is what you all in this journey we've been on helped me to see. Then on the third day, after everything is lost, then come the women back from the tomb with an odd tale about emptiness, angelic visitors, and strange proclamations. And the disciples, on the whole, don't believe them. Shocking, yes? They call the women's report an idle tale. In the Greek, it's something more like garbage. They say, this is garbage. But Peter believes. And I want to stop and give him a little kudos for that, like he might be the earliest adopter of the Believe Women movement in the history of humanity. Peter believes, and he runs to the tomb. I don't know if you caught that. He runs to the tomb. He doesn't walk, he runs. Which I realize is really surprising. At least it leapt out to me when I read it this time. Like, just for a second, imagine yourself in the following scenario. Over several years, you've nurtured a relationship with a mentor, a friend. You've traveled together, ate together, worked together, endured tough times, and you have confessed faith in this person beyond anything else you've loved or believed. And then you committed the ultimate betrayal. You ran away when you should have stayed. You lied when you should have told the truth. And you let down the person and the movement you most claim to be all in for. And so you sit in that despair for a little days, and then comes this rumor, the suggestion that this friend has returned. How do you feel? Are you motivated to run toward them? Or is there a little part of you that thinks you might hang back, slink away, be reluctant or guilty that you had failed in this way? What's really curious to me is that Peter doesn't seem to feel any of those things at all, right? He runs to the tomb. I think that detail is so salient because it tells us that he already knows all is forgiven. He already knows that if it's true, what the women say, that there is a love waiting for him outside that grave that is so large that it can swallow up all of his failings, all of his faults. Peter already knows that he is cherished by Jesus and that nothing can change that, not even death. And he runs toward that hope. And I think it's that moment in which he becomes the rock on which the church is built. Because it's that moment that he becomes an unshakable witness to life and to love. Now it's interesting, our tradition went on to make quite a bit of a connection between the resurrection and forgiveness. I don't know if you heard anything about that in Sunday school. And I understand more about that now in a way, like the fact that Jesus' disciples continued to experience him after his death was proof that the grace he embodied with them was something bigger, deeper, and more eternal than his singular life. But I think sometimes we get a little bit off track. We try to make that whole program of Christianity about getting forgiven, when really the whole thing seems to be about knowing that we are already steeping in a well of grace. I saw a quote graphic the other day on, yes, TikTok, that read something like, how would you live differently if you knew all was forgiven? If everything was known by everyone and everything was already pardoned, how would you go on? Which I thought was kind of a decent summary of the summons of the Christian life, right? Because beneath the whole idea of forgiveness is an even more radical and even more important idea about love. The claim that God's love is so vast and so profound and so incomprehensible that it embraces every part of it and that we need not be ashamed. And the witness of the disciples and of the mystics and the prophets and the justice warriors of every age has always been this: once you experience that love, You will spend the rest of your life running toward it shamelessly, and you will never again feel afraid. And so I guess the question is, how would you live if you were really in touch with that kind of confidence in your unshakable goodness? What would you run toward? What would you lay aside? What truth would you be eager to tell? What forgiveness would it free you to offer? What would it be like if you believed, as Boyle writes, that God is too occupied being unable to take her eyes off us to spend any time raising an eyebrow in disapproval? Now I know, that you know, that we are living in a time where hope feels kind of fragile, and when the act of hoping is not particularly en vogue. These days, it is more fashionable to despair over the world and to villainize those who have let us down on an individual or collective scale rather than to show grace. And it is true that we cannot understate how difficult things can be. But I think it is also true that the future, whatever it holds, will need more of us who know how to hope shamelessly. It will need more of us who have seen the promise of a life grounded in love and the gifts of a community shaped by practices of forgiveness and reconciliation. We can't run away from what's in front of us, so we have to run on, not in a haze of panic, but with the steady pace of those conditioned by an awareness of their own wholeness and fed by the kinship of mutuality that pushes us beyond our doors in service, in sharing, in steadfast solidarity, and in love. The resurrection is an invitation for us all to be Peters or to be Greg Boyles or to be one of the people who have been brave to hope and quick to forgive and eager to believe that love cannot be swallowed by death. I think about Peter running to that tomb, his heart full of hope, and I can imagine these words on his lips, and I know that every time we gather in this place on this day, they become our own, so let us say them now without shame. He is risen.
He is risen indeed.
Amen.